Essene Yahad, a Hebrew Nation Radio original. Speaking of the 364-day Qumran calendar, there are so many books, so many scholarly papers about this calendar, and I have found one very important paper by Jaubert, the scholar who recognized the antiquity of the 364-day Zadokite calendar, Jaubert. And here's our brother Darrell Ratberger to bring it alive for you.
The Calendar of Qumran and the Passion Narrative in John. Jaubert. The title of this chapter requires a preliminary comment. It seems to us that the calendar attested by the Qumran documents was more ancient and widespread than the Qumran milieu. We believe that it is of biblical origin and rooted in the strata of the priestly code. This calendar is advocated by the Book of Jubilees and by the Book of the Heavenly Luminaries of Enoch, which certainly had a wider area of influence than that of Qumran. There has also been found at Masada a liturgical scroll concerned with the burnt offering of the Sabbath and maintaining the same calendar. This discovery prompts reflection. Doubtless one can say that some Essenes who were participating in the Jewish revolt bad carried the scroll to Masada. It appears certain in fact that some Essenes had joined themselves to the Zealots in the war against the Romans, although it has not been shown that there were any Essenes at Masada. In any case, if an Essene liturgical scroll was preserved at Masada, it is because it could be considered sympathetically in an environment as intransigent as that of the Zealots, impassioned for the traditions of their ancestors and regrouped around Eleazar, the descendant of Judas the Galilean. The Masada discovery enlarges the range of the application of the Qumran calendar. Additional reasons point in the same direction. Indeed, the reappearance of this calendar in Christian or Jewish settings obliges us to think that the Qumran Essenes were only one of the groups which followed this calendar. Perhaps they were the ones who sought to observe it in its totality. In order to avoid the ambiguity of the name, Calendar of Qumran, and to simplify the title, the Old Priestly Calendar, we will call it the Zadokite calendar. The problem to be dealt with is that of the connections between the Johannine Passion narrative and the Zadokite calendar. Our purpose may appear to be a paradox, because John's Gospel is usually judged to be opposed to this calendar. And then this judgment is used as an argument against the long chronology of the Passion. According to the Gospel of John, in fact, Jesus dies at the moment when the Jews begin to sacrifice the Passover lambs in the temple. The points of reference for the fourth Gospel always appear as the official Jewish feasts, whether it concerns feasts which took place during the ministry of Jesus or the last Passover. As we have already had occasion to say, this point of view is normal in a catechesis addressed to a Hellenistic setting, which discerns especially the theological meaning that the Gospel attaches to the feasts of the Jews, henceforth the only temple as the unique high priest and the only victim is Christ himself. The complexity of the calendar was experienced only in Palestine. We know from elsewhere that even among the Palestinian groups which were most attached to the Zadokite calendar, the Temple of Jerusalem had always exercised a real fascination. It is known, however, and this is one of the most important results of the literary criticism of the texts, that John's Gospel comes at the end of a long catechetical reflection which embodies some ancient elements while bringing them into new perspectives. Our problem then is to discover if beyond the Johannine presentation which attaches itself to the official feasts, the materials used by the Gospel of John are in contradiction to the Zadokite calendar, or if, on the other hand, they are favorable to it. Before discussing the narrative of the Passion and especially that of the Last Supper, it is necessary to emphasize a curious correspondence between the Zadokite calendar and the Johannine resurrection narrative. It is known that there are within John's Gospel some narratives built on a weekly schema. One of them is found at the beginning of the Gospel. At the end of the Gospel, a week starts 6 days before the Passover, John 12 verse 1, and ends on the Sunday of the Resurrection. This Sunday is common to the early Christian tradition, but the Gospel of John is the only one to tell of an appearance 8 days later to the disciples, including Thomas, 20:26. That these 8 days indicate the week following is the opinion of the commentators. Now, there is no concern here for a weekly schema, since this week would be completely empty, nothing happens between Resurrection Sunday and the following Sunday. The description of the 8 days gives importance to the Sunday alone. If chapter 21, the appendix, is not taken into account, the 8th day of John 20 verse 26 concludes the Gospel. It begins the whole period of the time of the Church, the period of those who have not seen and yet believe. From a comparative study of the various resurrection narratives, the framework into which the evangelist places the appearance of Thomas must be of liturgical origin. The Sunday after the Passover would have therefore held a significance in the milieu of the author or in the tradition which he inherited. But from where could the importance of such a Sunday in certain sectors of primitive Christianity come? If the question is addressed to the official Jewish calendar, there is nothing which favors making this Sunday prominent. In this calendar, every feast is movable with respect to the days of the week and is dependent only on the day of the month. The 16th of Nisan, the day after the holiday of the Passover and the Feast of the Sheaf, could fall on any day of the week. But, according to the evangelists, in the year of Jesus' death, 16 Nisan was a Sunday. Hence, the Feast of the Sheaf fell on the same day in the official calendar, as in the reckoning of the Boethusians and the Samaritans, who interpreted Leviticus 23 verse 15 literally, so that the morrow after the Sabbath was always a Sunday, that is, Sunday within the week of unleavened bread. In short, the Sunday of the resurrection coincided with the offering of the sheaf in several reckonings, and the symbolism must have been perceived very early, but the Sunday following did not correspond to anything in these reckonings. The Feast of the Sheaf never had an octave, 8th day. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, which lasts 7 days, or 8 if 14 Nisan is counted when 15 Nisan was on the Sabbath, ended on Friday, not on Sunday. In contrast, in the Zadokite calendar the day after the Sabbath following the week of unleavened bread, the 26th of the first month, was an essential link, since the 50 days it opened regulated not only the date of the Zadokite Pentecost, the 15th of the third month, but that of the 50 days following, as the discovery of the temple scroll has confirmed. In this calendar alone, as J.P. Audit first pointed out, the Sunday of the appearance to Thomas can come from a liturgical source and support the symbolic significance that the author has given to it, the commencement for the time of the Church. It is difficult to say if at the final stage of the Gospel of John the meaning of the second Sunday was still perceived with respect to the calendar of 364 days. It appears only under the form of the Ogdoad, 8 days after, and it is thus that it has been preserved by the Christian liturgy. A curious text of Eustratius calls this Sunday Deuteroprot. One may interpret this expression as designating the second Sunday after the Wednesday of the Passover and the first Sunday of the 7 weeks of Pentecost. Was this an archaic term which had significance with regard to the Zadokite calendar? Be that as it may, this Sunday lived on in the Gospel of John only in the state of a liturgical remnant, but this remnant was of necessity linked at least originally with the Zadokite Passover of Tuesday/Wednesday, since it was calculated in accordance with it. This discovery can only encourage the search to see if the Last Supper of Jesus according to John preserves any traces of the Zadokite Passover. A later cross-checking raises the same question. In certain sectors of early Christianity, the reading of the washing of the feet according to John was set for Tuesday/Wednesday of Holy Week. Such is the case for the Nestorian liturgy, the conservative character of which is recognized. We should also note some early Syriac sermons on Holy Week attributed to Ephraim, in which the commentary on the washing of the feet is made on the night of Tuesday to Wednesday, and also point out the oldest known Roman lectionary which places on Tuesday evening the pericope of the washing of the feet. These passages suggest that at an early time the reading of the washing of the feet conveyed with it the day of Tuesday/Wednesday, even in the settings where no memory of a Last Supper on Tuesday evening existed. Wednesday, 15th of the first month, and Sunday, 26th of the first month, could have been thought of as a liturgical unity, thus maintaining some stability when the calendar of 364 days was tending to break it up. The Wednesday of the Passover was calculated in accordance with the full moon and after the equinox. To keep this Wednesday, it was brought as near as possible to the beginning of the ideal year, which had been effected on the 4th day of creation when God had created the luminaries. The moon had naturally been created full, and it is often considered that there was in the Israelite calendar a transfer from the 1st to the 15th of the month. For Jews who faithfully observed the Passover according to this calendar, the triple dimension, Wednesday, full moon, equinox, permitted the 14th day of the first month to be tested reliably, independently of the calendar of 364 days. The case of the Yazidis shows that this calculation is not purely theoretical. The date for the washing of the feet survived on account of its ritual character. This liturgical information supplied by the early church leads us to think that at least certain Johannine circles reenacted on Tuesday evening the feet-washing ceremony. Moreover, we saw above that the Sunday of the appearance to Thomas obtains meaning only according to the Zadokite calendar. This Sunday is exterior to the week of unleavened bread. It is the second Sunday after the Tuesday/Wednesday of the Passover. A milieu which venerated this Sunday would have also celebrated the Passover on Tuesday evening. Hence, by two different observations we are driven to the same question: is there in the Johannine sources a trace of the commemoration of the Eucharist on Tuesday evening? Our primary task is now to attempt to discover if Jesus' last meal according to John contains any characteristics of the Passover. Let us apply ourselves first to the farewell discourses. The plural is used because criticism has distinguished here three discourses: John 17, John 15-16, and John 13 verses 31-14, 31. John 14 verse 31 is more closely connected to John 18 verse 1 than it is to the other two discourses. Rise, let us go hence. 14:31, Jesus went forth with his disciples. 18:1. John 14 verse 30 announced the coming of the prince of this world. In 18:2 Judas comes forward as the instrument of the devil. Cf 13, the discourse 13:31-14:31, even if it has been altered, probably belongs to the oldest stratum of the gospel. This first discourse presents a rather remarkable structure. It is punctuated by 4 interruptions on the part of the disciples of Jesus. Simon Peter says to him, "Lord, where are you going?" 13:36. Thomas says to him, "Lord, we do not know where you are going, how can we know the way?" 14:5, Philip says to him, "Lord, show us the Father, and we shall be satisfied." 14:8. Judas, not Iscariot, says to him, "Lord, how is it that you manifest yourself to us and not to the world?" L 4:22. Of these 4 interruptions, 3 are interrogative in form: Simon Peter, Thomas, Judas. The fourth, that of Philip, induces the explanations of Jesus as well. As is well known, it was customary at the Passover meal for the sons to ask for some explanations from the father of the family. In Makeda Exodus 4 questions from 4 types of sons are provided. A passage in the Talmud foresees even that 2 rabbis may question one another. In one type of Passover meal among men, and not a family affair, the participants could sometimes question one another or more normally question their master. These successive questions could therefore reflect a Passover custom. This observation takes on added interest if it is recalled that the customary form of farewell discourse is that of exhortations and injunctions. It is not composed of interrogatives. The themes treated are more important. The themes of the Passover vigil were the recall of the Exodus, the departure from Egypt, the waiting for the Messiah. During the Passover night, in fact, the Israelites, supporting themselves on the marvels of the past, were entirely turned towards the liberation to come, which the coming of the Messiah would usher in. It is quite evident that these Jewish themes could only be changed in the Johannine presentation. But they are easy to locate. It is in fact a question only of the departure of Jesus and of his return, or of his coming. The departure of Jesus, who passed from this world to the Father, 13:1, indicates the great exodus in which the disciples would participate later. Hence, in the first discourse the questions concern the exodus of Jesus. Where are you going? 13:36. How can we know the way? 14:5. This departure is the pledge of the return of Jesus, who will come to take his disciples with him. 14:2 and following. One will note the insistence on the coming of Jesus, an especially paschal theme, which in the Johannine transposition is expressed also in the coming of Jesus with his Father and by the Spirit. And when I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself. 14:3, I will not leave you desolate, I will come to you, you will see me. 14:18 and following. The Counselor, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name. 14:26. You heard me say to you, I go away, and I will come to you. 14:28. Thus, in the first discourse the paschal theme of the coming of the Messiah is still very clear. However, the theme has evolved towards the idea of an interior coming of the Father. of the Son and of the Spirit. The evolution is more marked in the second discourse, in which the themes of departure and of coming in chapter 16, verses 5 to 7, 16, 19, 22, 28, move towards the idea of the coming of the Spirit, 16:7, 12, 15, while in chapter 15 the allegory of the vine puts into relief the mutual indwelling. The evolution is even more advanced in the third discourse, chapter 17, which is a meditation in which the paschal theme is no longer discerned. The paschal color of the farewell discourses is softened in the last stage of composition. This is quite natural if one considers that its actual form moves the reader towards the Passover of the death of Jesus, that of Friday. As we now pass on to the first part of the Johannine evening, 13, 1:30, will we be able to discover any traits favorable to the paschal nature of the meal? The search is difficult because the evangelist must have retained only the elements which were still interesting to the Christian community. Neither in John nor in the Synoptics can we expect to find an exhaustive description of Jesus' last meal. The specialists, however, have attempted to disclose the details which argue for or against a paschal ritual. We will not dwell on the reasons strongly argued elsewhere, which point in the direction of the paschal character: a meal where the guests are lying beside the table, a night meal, a night when one does not leave Jerusalem. These traits clearly distinguish Jesus' last meal from an ordinary meal. But there is another point of which we would like to show the importance, that of the washing of the feet. We have presented the hypothesis that the rite was conserved as part of a celebration and that this celebration anciently had a paschal character. Is it possible to verify the merits of this hypothesis? The atmosphere of the celebration is confirmed by the solemnity of the words which introduce Jesus' action. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them to the end. And during supper the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given him into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, rose from supper, laid aside his garments, and girded himself with a towel. Then he poured water into a basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. John 13 verses 1 to 5. This sentence, which is curiously formed and extraordinary in length, is probably the result of modification. It has caused some ingenious explanations from literary critics, but these remain hypothetical due to the difficulties in reconstructing the prehistory of the text. As this sentence stands at the present moment and precisely by its length, it puts into striking relief the action which inaugurates and prefigures the Passion according to John. The scene of the washing of the feet is placed under the sign of the hour. That hour is frequently announced in the Gospel and concerns the passing to the Father under the sign of love carried to its peak. Under the sign of betrayal, which is the rupture in this meal of love, the cross is already present through Judas, who hands over Jesus. As soon as the traitor has consummated the rupture, Jesus can say that the Son of Man has been glorified. 13:31. Finally, the introduction terminates with this affirmation which sums up the mystery of the Word made flesh, knowing that he had come from God and was going to God. After this solemn announcement, one will note the precision of the details which describe the actions of Jesus: the rising, the laying aside of his garments, the pouring of water into a basin, the taking of a towel and girding himself with it, the washing, the drying with the towel. So meticulous a description is well explained by the hypothesis of an actual ritual in the Johannine community. In verse 12 Jesus takes up his garments and resumes his seat. Finally, in verses 14 and following comes the command to repeat the action: "You ought also to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do as I have done to you." The ritual interpretation which has been suggested to us by the later patristic evidence appears to be well in accord with the commemorative setting furnished by the Gospel and equally with the mentality which craves for concrete and expressive gestures. Our opinion is not entirely new. G. Bertram thought that the washing of feet was based on a custom otherwise unknown. The problem, therefore, is less to seek the significance of the feet washing in the Johannine redaction than to ask ourselves about a possible connection between this rite and the Paschal celebration. It will be noted that another allusion in the text, that of the bath, inserts itself easily into a Paschal perspective. To the words of Peter, "Lord, not my feet only but also my hands and my head." John 13 verse 9, Jesus responds, he that has bathed does not need to wash, except for his feet, he is entirely clean, John 13 verse 10, so it would be inadequate, it seems to us, to see in the term elaminos, bathed, only an evocation of Christian baptism. In the Johannine presentation, the disciples have taken a bath before coming to the meal. For an ordinary meal it was sufficient to wash the hands, cf. Mark 7 verse 2 and following. In contrast, the Paschal meal demanded a high degree of ritual purity. It seems that at the time of Jesus bathing was rather widespread among the laity but obligatory according to the rabbinic sources only in certain cases. The Gospel of John twice recalls the purifications necessary for the Passover, 11:55, 18:28. If a bathing preceded the meal, it is an argument in favor of the meal's paschal character. The washing of the feet poses more questions, not because it doubles the bathing, one can accept the common explanation of a complementary purification, but because it takes place in the course of the meal. Jesus rose from the table. It is true that one can suppose that within the meal some parts were important or of special sanctity. We should not, however, apply to Jesus' last meal the Mishnaic rules which govern the paschal meals of the family. The Last Supper was a meal among men, without women and children. According to the Book of Jubilees, the Passover must be eaten in the sanctuary by men 20 years of age and over, Jubilees 49:16 and following. In the broad milieu which the Book of Jubilees represents, the Passover was a very holy sacrifice which necessitated its being eaten in a holy place, in principle, in the temple. It was impossible for the Zadokites to eat the Passover in the temple, but one imagines that the Zadokite Passover, in conformity with the Levitical traditions, had conserved the very strict rules of purification. Philo of Alexandria declares that at the Passover the whole nation acts as priest, each for his part celebrating and performing his appropriate sacrifices. Each house at that moment assumes the likeness and the dignity of a temple. Those who have assembled themselves for the banquet have been purified by the purification lustrations. Philo, in the non-allegorical treatises, is an excellent witness to the Jewish rites before the ruin of the temple. He reflects a more traditional mentality than that which interpret leniently the biblical rules of paschal purification. His testimony calls for a consideration of the influences by the Levitical movements on the paschal practice. Certainly this was even more true of the Zadokite Passover. If each house is like a temple, then one would have to observe there the rules of purification applicable to the temple. These rules are known: bathings, purifications of hands and feet. According to a ritual of which Jubilees and the Testament of Levi witness at the time, it is necessary to wash the hands and the feet before and after drawing near to the altar. Other passages in the Testament of Levi speak of purifications during the sacrifice, and in the Greek edition of these texts the dialectal luion, to bathe, /niption, to wash, occurs in the narrative of the washing of the feet. The analogy of the Testament of Levi is interesting since we can find nothing closer to a Zadokite milieu. Although it is an analogy, we do not believe that we overstep our sources by thinking that in a Zadokite milieu the celebration of the Passover by guests who were perceived as priests must normally have called for some supplementary purifications. In the Johannine narrative of the washing of the feet, the astonishment of the disciples did not arise from the strangeness of the rite but from the fact that the Master put himself in the position of a slave. It is quite in the manner of the evangelist to show the alteration of the Jewish rites effected by Jesus. At Cana the water of the Jewish purifications was changed into wine. In Samaria, Jesus, a new Jacob, was offering the water of the Spirit which springs up from his own well. He was himself the new temple from which the source went out. John 7 verse 38.
Jackson Snyder presents will return after these important messages. Snyder Presents has returned just as we promised.
Jesus was transforming the rite of the feet washing by making it the sign of his love and a prelude to the humiliation of the cross. By this he also was reversing the hierarchy which appeared to have existed at the last meal, and he was founding a new order of ministry. The gesture of the washing of the feet, quite unexpected as it may be on the part of Jesus, did not appear as a bizarre gesture, deprived of immediate significance. It inserted itself with verisimilitude into a context of paschal purifications, current in some law-abiding milieu of the Levitical traditions. It is a commonplace gesture that the evangelist has put into relief because of the new meaning which it assumes. Should we say that the evangelist was dependent on a Zadokite source for Jesus' last meal? Do we not freely admit that the evangelist has preserved ties with the original Baptist, Essene and Levite milieu? Moreover, Zadokite influence appears proved in the case of the Sunday after Passover. Concerning the feet washing, we think that if Jesus had not actually accomplished this act of humility, it would not have been ascribed to him. Why should the source not be the witness of the disciple whom Jesus loved? The disciple whom Jesus loved must have been a disciple of John the Baptist, as the first chapter of the Gospel shows, John 1 verse 35, and John the Baptist, according to Luke 1 verse 5 and following, was of a priestly family. His relations with the temple appear to have been rather cold, Matthew 1 verse 7, 21 verses 23 to 26, John 1 verse 19 and following. This attitude connects him with the Levitical circles which did not approve of the development of the cult in the temple, foremost among those were the Essenes. Other chapters in the present book reveal some of the important relationships between the sources of the fourth Gospel and the Zadokite milieu. Thus the cultural background of the Gospel is explained. If we take up again the combined results of this analysis, we see that the Gospel of John can no longer be considered the great argument against Jesus' Last Supper being a Passover meal. The sources used by the evangelist favor the paschal and Zadokite character of Jesus' Last Supper. This conclusion is revealed by the structure and the themes of the first farewell discourse, by the rites of purification presupposed by the washing of feet, and by the correspondence with the date of the appearance to Thomas. In his actual presentation, however, the evangelist describes only one Passover celebration, that concomitant with the death of Jesus. He does not note any divergence in time between the Last Supper and the day of the crucifixion. This raises the question of the formation of the Johannine Passion narrative. According to our hypothesis, this narrative was formed by two commemorative celebrations inserted into the liturgical practice of the primitive church, the evening of Tuesday/Wednesday and the day of Friday. Let us examine these in order. The night of Tuesday/Wednesday began with the evening meal and ended when the cock crew. The importance of the crowing, which in the Gospels accompanies Peter's denial, may be explained in a liturgical framework. It marked the end of the evening celebration. The synoptic tradition then mentions the tears of Peter. His sorrow must have been reenacted by the early worshippers. The sorrow of Jesus' followers is announced in the farewell discourse. I say to you, you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. John 16 verse 20. Sorrow and fasting went together. We are not informed about fasting in the Johannine community. In the liturgical tradition connected with the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, it is the treachery of Judas to which the fasting of Wednesday is attached. The sorrow must therefore originally have begun during the preceding night. In a Syriac canon attributed to Ignatius of Antioch, a fast is imposed during the night of Tuesday/Wednesday. The alleged motive, however, is not the treachery of Judas, but the sadness of the disciples, or of Jesus, before the announcement of the Passion. One cannot, however, reduce to a single liturgical type the life of the Church at the beginning of Christianity. A commemoration of Jesus' Last Supper on the night of Tuesday/Wednesday was scarcely able to survive except in circles which remained close to the priestly beginnings. The memory of it could only be sustained in conservative circles like those of the Didascalia or of the Nestorians. In these circles of the Johannine tradition in which the custom of the washing of feet continued, the night of Tuesday/Wednesday was preserved but its paschal character was lost. In contrast, the liturgical type represented by the Epistola Apostolorum, often considered as a quartodeciman writing, may have preserved the paschal character of the celebration, although it lost the day of the week. The vigil celebrated the Lord's action and his love until the cocks crow. We have seen that certain themes were connected with those of the Johannine vigil. The second liturgical support on which the Passion narrative according to John is founded is the Friday of the Roman condemnation and of the crucifixion. This Friday was a commemorative day according to the Gospel of Mark, in which the time of the crucifixion is divided up according to a liturgical schedule of 3 hours following 3 hours. The strength of the primitive tradition of the coincidence of Jesus' death with the official Passover, with the correlative application to Jesus of the symbolism of the Paschal Lamb, while the Zadokite calendar was being forgotten, caused the transfer of the Paschal emphasis to the day of the death of Jesus. The author of the fourth Gospel exploited the significance of the kingship of Jesus over against that of Caesar, by making the crowning with thorns a central scene on this day. All the episodes from the proceedings before Pilate could be commemorated on this day. In this case, the period in between, which according to our theory covers Wednesday and Thursday, remained a liturgical blank. This historical cavity is visible in John 18 verse 28, nothing happens before Caiaphas. The memory of the Sanhedrin sessions was preserved only by the synoptic tradition with varying arrangements. John has no need of the Jewish trial. He has emphasized throughout his Gospel the full theological weight of the confrontation between the Jews and Jesus. He recalls only Jesus coming before Annas, which was situated in the framework of the Passover night. The Johannine Passion narrative is thus formed from two ancient commemorations, the Passover night and the day of the crucifixion. Their juxtaposition has given the impression of a continuity between the night of the vigil of Tuesday and the day of Friday, which appeared as the following day. Although the final redactor of the Johannine Gospel has conserved in a very exact fashion the chronological notations in relation to the official Passover, 13:1, 1828, 1914, he has not sought to erase this impression. We have just seen that he has no theological interest in exploiting Jesus' appearance before Caiaphas. On the other hand, it is probable that at the last stage of the composition of the Gospel of John, there were already in circulation some differing traditions concerning the chronology of the Passion. The Syriac groups preserved a conscious memory of Wednesday, but the Hellenistic circles forgot the Zadokite Passover and then lost the paschal character of the meal. The celebrated calendar of the official Jewish Passover, the only one known in these circles, helped to reduce the time of the Passion in the synoptic stream. The tradition recorded in Mark and Matthew, which came from a source which was very definite about the Paschal meal, rejected the Wednesday as the prelude to the Passion. At the final literary stage of the fourth Gospel, there must have been an interaction between the Johannine circles and the other streams of Christianity. The faithfulness of the redactor to his sources consisted in not going beyond them. He remains in the end nearer to the primitive outline than the synoptic evangelists, who bad integrated information from different sources and who, in drawing the Passover meal nearer to the death of Jesus, had to transfer the Wednesday, the 2 days, of Matthew 26 verse 2, before this meal. In order to rediscover the original outline, it is necessary to refer to the various testimonies of the ancient church, often through an unconscious liturgical memory, and it is necessary to go back again to the Zadokite calendar, which alone was able to give the key to a rather complex evolution.
And that's the end of the reading. Great job, Darrell. Thank you. Well, my friends, that essay was packed. Absolutely packed with little facts that add up to a very big conclusion, that the scripture does in fact use the 364-day Zadokite calendar to extract dates and times for its events. I gotta say, it wasn't a very exciting reading, but it certainly was informational, and I hope you could use some of that information for your own studies of Zadokite history, calendar, and demise. Now, for the rest of this time, let's see what I can come up with here. And I thank you for listening to Jackson Snyder Presents.
If you don't have any place to go on Shabbat to fulfill the commandment for a holy convocation, come join us online every Shabbat at 11 o'clock a.m. Eastern Time. Download and install the client from zoom.us. And when the time comes, just surf to www.theyahad.com. It's that easy. You can be anonymous if you want to. You're going to hear a great liturgy and an even greater sermon every week. Pretty soon you'll get to know the people that come, and you'll feel good knowing that you worshiped on Shabbat with other like-minded believers. You're invited. Download and install the Zoom meeting client from zoom.us and then surf to theyahad.com. See you there!
The calendar year of weeks and double code scheme. I gather from the study group report that Atchison and Murphy envisioned a 364-day calendar year in which one day, the Sabbath, was doubled. There is no evidence that this ever was the case, Roth noted. Nevertheless, Atchison and Murphy were on the right track. At the risk of repeating what was said at the study group meeting, I will point out the vestiges of a 364-day calendar in the text of the Old Testament and show certain calendar days other than the Sabbath were doubled. A 364-day calendar that keeps in step with the solar cycle is described in the pseudepigraphic books of Jubilees and Enoch. Chapter 72 of Enoch depicts a calendar year divided into 4 equal sections of 91 days, each consisting of 3 months of 30, 30, and 31 days. The text tracks month by month the portals, where the sun rises and sets on the horizon and the related incremental changes in daytime versus nighttime. The year starts with the sun at the spring equinox with day and night of equal length, and after 12 months of 364 calendar days the sun returns to the spring equinox. Thus, in 364 calendar days the sun completes the solar cycle of 365 and a quarter standard days. The Book of Enoch is not canonical. The reality of the 364-day calendar in the tradition of the Hebrew people was not confirmed until the 1950s when scholars determined the Dead Sea Scrolls included a description of such a calendar. The start of the calendar year was pegged to the 4th day of creation, Wednesday, when the Almighty created the luminaries of sun, moon, and stars, which the people of the scrolls regarded as the divine measure of time. The people of the scrolls and their calendar are generally viewed as an offshoot of mainstream Judaism. The religious practices of standard Judaism are dated in a lunisolar calendar said to derive from the Old Testament. Annie Jaubert, however, maintains the Old Testament was framed in a 364-day calendar. Her thesis relies on a curious property of the 364-day calendar. A date in this calendar, the name of a month along with the day of the month, singles out a specific day of the week, irrespective of the year. Jaubert showed the dated activities mentioned in the Old Testament would not fall on the Sabbath, the ordained day of rest, if the dates of the activities pertain to a 364-day calendar. The arguments raised against her thesis are legion. Morgenstern, for example, noted 3 or 4 different calendars were employed in Israel during the long period covered by biblical literature. Wacholder and Wacholder claimed that biblical numerology favored certain dates of the month, which gave the illusion that the dates pertained to a 364-day calendar. Beckwith sketched several impractical intercalation schemes that scholars have offered to bring the 364-day calendar into line with the solar year. The schemes offered did not consider a most simple way to match the 364-day calendar year to the solar cycle, namely, double the span of one calendar day every year and another one every 4th year. The span of 2 days treated as a single calendar day was a regular feature of the calendar Julius Caesar obtained from Egypt. The bisextile day of the Julian calendar, February 24th, was a double day every 4th year. Bisextile means having the extra day like the 29th of February for a leap year. In the Old Testament, the doubling of a day is attested in 1 Samuel 20. The events described in the chapter substantiate that a 2-day equinox festival was observed on a single New Year's Day. The equinox in a solar calendar moves forward incrementally for 3 years and then retreats 1 day in the leap year. Hence an equinox festival must last 2 standard days so as to ensure the equinox occurs during the celebration. 1 Samuel 20 recounts the tale of David hiding from King Saul who intends to murder him. David enlists the help of Jonathan and says, literally, "Hear Kodesh tomorrow," as in verse 5. In present-day Hebrew, Kodesh means new, month, and new moon, and accordingly the passage is conventionally translated, "Behold, tomorrow is the new moon." We are told that, though the word only means new, it is a euphemism for new moon. As the story unfolds, we learn David is expected at Saul's table to celebrate the Kodesh on 2 successive evenings. But a new moon celebration on 2 successive evenings is unknown in biblical texts. Further, the text refers to the day of the second Kodesh and the second Kodesh, according to 1 Samuel 20:27 and 34. A new moon does not have a second day. Translations treat the anomaly in various ways, including the supposition of scribal error. A preferable interpretation would recognize that Kodesh in the Old Testament generally signifies new month and new year. Thus the first day of the New Year festival in the time of David was called the Kodesh and the second day HaKodesh II. I developed the thesis that David hid from Saul during a double-day Kodesh festival in a series of posting on the ANE listserv in 2004 to 2005. My proposal encountered much criticism and minimal support. In addition to the Kodesh festival, the Festival of Weeks, or Shavuot, includes traces of a double day that occurs intermittently, presumably every 4th year. The New Years and weeks are the only Jewish holidays customarily celebrated for 2 days. Weeks is observed 7 times 7 is equal to 49 days after Passover, thus highlighting the week of 7 days characteristic of the 364-day calendar. Further, weeks is unique among Jewish holidays in that its observance is specified as occurring so many days after a particular date. The avoidance of naming the calendar date likely is due to the holiday's origin as an equinox festival observed for a double day in a leap year and a single day in other years. In Leviticus 23, the Almighty conveyed to Moses the timetable and rules relevant to weeks, the Sabbath, Yom Kippur, Passover, and other holidays. The set of regulations have come down to modern times within the framework of a lunisolar calendar. Leviticus 23 ver 24 contravenes the solar 364-day calendar. It decrees that the first day of the 7th month, the start of the Jewish New Year, be celebrated for a single day, thus implying the calendar is lunar. Nevertheless, the chapter is a palimpsest that leaves the erasures of the 364-day calendar readable. The obscure early Israelite calendar has been commented on and debated for over 2,000 years. The disputations no longer have the intensity they had in antiquity. Calendars in olden times were understood to reflect the order of the cosmos. Communities that employed the 364-day calendar, such as the people of the scroll, believed each day of the week had an ordained significance and every festival had to fall on its appropriate day. The introduction of the lunar calendar established a schedule of observances that undermined the belief system linked to the 7 days of the week. The history whereby the non-traditional lunar calendar came to dominate Jewish timekeeping has not been adequately examined.
This is your host. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed our variety show, Jackson Snyder Presents. This is a presentation of the Vero Essene Yahad in Vero Beach, Florida. If you would like more information about today's broadcast, email jackson@HebrewNation.net or visit HebrewNationOnline.com. Until we meet again, may Yahweh keep you safe and close to home.